Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Today we're going to take a step back from modern media and take a look at one of the classics of the English language and the concept of fan fiction in an open domain and the old concept of my books to read list being far too long to ever be fully read. To start with, though, a personal story. Imagine Bitty Betty is a tiny tot who has been asking her mom some big questions about life and death. Mom is giving her answers, and there's a joyful light in Mom's eyes that takes away all of the fear that always goes along with the big questions. Mom tells Bitty Betty about the place beyond this life, a place where things are more real than they are here. A place where the very grass itself is so real that it would hurt your feet to walk it until you grow real enough to be in tune with it. She asks if Bitty Betty can remember what life was like in the womb before she came out into the world. Bitty Betty, of course, can't. Mom tells of how the next world is more real, not less, of grass that hurts the feet because it's so real. How we will become more real as we get older in the next world. However, Mom stresses that she doesn't understand for sure. This is just one way to think about it. And Bitty Betty will have to learn to think about it on her own, in her own time. Bitty Betty, in fact, will have to do a lot of her own thinking and reasoning, because just as the baby in the womb can't understand the world outside the womb, we can't understand the world that comes after this. Bitty Betty is left in awe of Mom's wisdom. Bitty Betty is also vaguely aware that Mom mentions some name, some book that the ideas maybe come from, but as far as little Bitty Betty is aware, this is Mom's wisdom, Mom's words. Nothing Mom says to the contrary will dispel this understanding for quite some time. That's just the way that small children work. So, that is where the story begins for me, but as you can imagine, the story has much deeper roots than this. But before that, let's talk about Some Humans Are Weird, I Have the Data, a book of human absurdity. Check out the links below the video to get yourself a copy of the book where Monty Python meets Star Trek. On a technical advertising note, when I post my book on Facebook groups, I try to mix up what it's writing. It's just good marketing so people don't learn to just edit out your advertisements. And I learned something very interesting. When I post the phrase, humans are weird, I have the data, Monty Python meets Star Trek in this book of human absurdity, Facebook is apparently fine with it, doesn't see anything to flag. When I post humans are weird, I have the data, a book of human absurdity, Monty Python meets Star Trek, Facebook is also fine with it. But if I post Monty Python meets Star Trek in a book of human absurdity, humans are weird, I have the data, bada boom, bada bing, banned. Facebook strikes the post for, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to guess what it struck the post for. I kid you not, selling live animals. So apparently the bots read a reference to one of the greatest British acting troupes of all time as a reference to an actual python. So anyway, that's just some interesting information if you're thinking about advertising on Facebook. Do not reference Monty Python in your first sentence, or do not make it the subject of your first sentence. Anyway, so I have to wonder, does this glitch affect the sale of all Monty Python products? Does the BBC have to be careful about how they advertise these days? Do they have trouble moving Bear Grylls gear? Do you have to be careful getting rid of your Hello Kitty products? Anyway, I thought that was odd and a little amusing. But back to the main point of the video. Long story short, I recently read a book that has been on my to-read list for 2.5 decades. Halfway through the book, I got hit in the face by several shocking realizations at once. It made me stop reading, or rather stop the playback because I was listening to an audiobook as I drove, and not even I am crazy enough to actually read while driving. And really consider but anyway, it caused me to step back and really consider my life for a moment, which is a good thing which is one of the safer things to do when you're driving along a mountain road. Now, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, I want to sort of list all the ideas that cascaded through my mind as a result of this revelation. This is largely because I fear this is going to spiral into a 2, 3, or even 4-part series at least. We will see, and I want to get all these ideas out while the videos are still fresh in your brain. These are the points I took away from my experience with the book. First and foremost, we are for the most part cripplingly ignorant of the forces that forge us. We are a mass of conflicting ideas and personalities, and even the ones that we can trace back to ideas out in the world and not just our own genes, we're not really sure where any of them come from. Second, we are all human, and no matter how great or small we might be by the measurement of the world, ultimately we all share the same desires and needs, as every human who lived before us. Third, the explosion of technology and wealth in the past 100 years has allowed these universal needs to be met for more people than ever before in ways that would be impossible in former days. And fourthly, the explosion of technology and wealth in the past 100 years has allowed us to trace and record these forces in ways we haven't been able to before. Anybody can go and trace primary sources now. But what does the book that set my brain down the rabbit hole have to do with all this? And what was this rabbit hole? And what was the book? Because this is the simplest question. What was the book? I'll start off with that. The book was The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. In of itself, it's an allegory that discusses some of the big issues such as free will, predestination, life after death, divine justice, and this is all told through the metaphor of taking a bus ride from hell to heaven. Nothing particularly original there. It goes as far back as Dante's Divine Comedy, and even further back than that. I mean, Dante got his ideas for hell out of the Aeneid, which was written by Virgil, and Virgil got most of his ideas from hell out of, was it the Odyssey or the Iliad? Odyssey was that one, the Iliad was the Troy story. Anyway, so Aeneid got his idea from the Odyssey. The Odyssey was a written version of the collected oral traditions of ancient Greece. And so, again, this is an idea that goes way, way back. So, again, not an original idea, but considered very well done. There, the point of view character talks to various ghosts and real people. Most of the people represent various sins or virtues in various stages of development: cruelty, arrogance, and lust, versus mother love, dedication to the truth, and forgiveness. For example, the usual suspects in this kind of allegory. To grossly simplify the point of the books, the conclusion is that we are beings of free will, that our choices matter, and above all, we mortal beings should be humble and not make unequivocal statements about things that we do not understand. Except the points were nothing like that. Seriously, go read the book. I cannot possibly do justice to what C.S. Lewis put down there. It's good stuff, and as the BBC has said before about C.S. Lewis's work, it reads easier than most mystery novels. If the points of The Great Divorce sound familiar, well, it should. We'll get there at some point. On a personal note, I had been avoiding this book for the past few years. I have to deal with some anxiety in my life, all sort of biochemically sourced, and I prefer to read the kind of book that I thought this was when I am in a clear mental state and not likely to get the nervous jitters from any strong emotion. I thought this was going to be one of Lewis's thought-provoking essays, much like Meditation in a Tool Shed, or one of his famous analysis of current scientific and philosophical thought, which I do enjoy, but I have to be in the right mindset to really process without gnawing my legs off in frustration. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that it was quite a Narnia-like allegory. In fact, it shares many parallel themes and much parallel imagery with the last battle from the Chronicles of Narnia. So, of course, I took a few seconds to kick myself for putting this off as long as I had. Pointless self-flagellation over. Now, I'm going off on a rabbit trail on another author entirely. However, before I do that, I want you to cast your mind back to the inciting incident of the Narnia-verse. Namely, when Lucy steps through the wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The wardrobe is in an upper room, but not necessarily the attic. That will be important. Lucy definitely has to make a conscious choice to enter Narnia each time. Also kind of important. And barring any person stopping her on the other side, she is perfectly free to consciously leave it whenever she wants. Now, back to my other author, George MacDonald. I discovered him in a historical fiction book by the name of The Peasant Girl's Dream. It is technically a romance because the two main characters do eventually fall in love and get together, but it is mostly a story about the life and times in Scotland and the trials faced by peasant and lord alike. I honestly can't remember why I picked up the book in the first place. It didn't center around a dog, a horse, or a spaceship, which were my three main criteria for books at that point in life. I just remember reading it and being intrigued. Eventually, I would continue and read as many stories of George MacDonald's as I could. As my analytical ability grew to match my artistic appreciation, I began to consider MacDonald to be the father of science fiction, right up there with Mary Shelley. In fact, I didn't get this till recently, but he actually actually references Mary Shelley in some of his later works. But where Mary Shelley gave science fiction its literal and metaphorical body by speculating on the social results of scientific advancement through the medium of fiction, George MacDonald gave it its soul. It is more obviously in his fairy tales, where his heroes frequently slip through portals into what would more easily be recognized as alien worlds and ecosystem than any proper fairyland. But it's found in other places too, just casual comments dropped in the middle of what would be otherwise mundane historical romances. The main example of this is with a character named Cosmo. Cosmo is a young man, the son of a laird of Scotland, and he's being from an impoverished family. He's been set out in the world to earn his way. Now, most notably in this book, there's one line where Cosmo meets an older Scotsman digging in a garden and offers to take up the old man's spade in exchange for a place to bathe and change his shirt. They haggle a bit, and in due course it comes out that the old gardener comes from the same town, Muro Warlock, as the young man does. Now, before this old gardener had learned this, he had been deeply suspicious and seemed to utterly reject any claim that the young man had on his hospitality. But on hearing that the young man comes from his old hometown, the old man opens his home to the younger Scotsman. Now, the paragraph that stuck with me was this one. Now, listen carefully. The old man had a heart after all. Strange, the power of that comparatively poor thing, local association, to bring to light the eternal love at the root of the being. Wonderful sign also of the presence of God, wherever a child may open eyes. This man's heart was not yet big enough to love a Scotsman, but it was big enough to love a Muro Warlock man. And was not that a precious beginning? A beginning as good as any? It matters nothing where or how one begins, if only one does begin. There are many, doubtless, who have not yet got farther in love than their own family, but there are others who have learned that for the true heart there is neither Frenchman nor Englishman, neither Jew nor Greek, neither white nor black, only the sons and daughters of God, only the brothers and sisters of one elder brother. There may be some who have learned to love all the people of their own planet, but have not yet learned to look with patience upon those of Saturn or Mercury, while others there must be who, wherever there is a creature of God's making, love each in its capacity for love, from the archangel before God's throne to the creeping thing that he may be compelled to destroy, from the man of this earth to the man of some system of worlds which no human telescope has yet brought within the ken of heaven-pouring sage. And to that it must come with every one of us, for not until we are true men, true women, the children, that is, of him in whose image we are made. And I just found it very interesting that he drops this paragraph in a book where the main character's name is Cosmo. Now, if this author sidetrack from his main story of romance and mystery and puzzle solving, which was written 8 decades before Star Trek was a gleam in the eye of a Los Angeles patrol officer, sounds familiar, it is because this is the principle that Gene Roddenberry founded Star Trek on. The main element that sets Star Trek and its Federation apart from the rest of science fiction based on combat and war. Why the creatures formed by science, data, and such are seen as people to be loved rather than Frankenstein's monster. Now, here we find the seed of the idea that flowered into Spock crying out in pain as he forms the empathic connection with the Horta. Here is the root that supports the branch of Commander Sisko's openly weeping over the dead Jem'Hedar he's killed, crying out, "If only we had trusted each other." No doubt, this concept of quite literal universal love of a galactic community of neighbors passed through several minds before it settled in Roddenberry, but I don't doubt that the origins of this aspect of science fiction started right here with a Scottish authors of fairy tales, romances, and a bent for science. Moving along in our progression, MacDonald wrote from the mid to late 1800s, and his actual life overlapped with C.S. Lewis's by about, 10 years, I think. They were not to meet in the body, as it were, with MacDonald growing old and dying in Scotland, while Lewis scampered about as a young boy in the green fields of Ireland. They never met, they never spoke. But one day, nearly a decade after George MacDonald had passed, C.S. Lewis met him for the first time, in Lewis's own words, from one of his books. I was in the habit of walking over to Leatherhead about once a week and sometimes taking the train back. In summer, I did so chiefly because Leatherhead boasted a tiny swimming bath, better than nothing to me who had learned to swim almost before I can remember, and who, till middle age and rheumatism crept upon me, was passionately fond of being in water. But I went in winter too, to look for books and to get my hair cut. The evening that I now speak of was in October, and I and one porter had the long timbered platform of Leatherhead Station to ourselves. It was getting just dark enough for the smoke of an engine to glow red on the underside with the reflection of the furnace. The hills beyond the Dorking Valley were of a blue so intense as to be nearly violet, and the sky was green with frost. My ears tingled with the cold. The glorious weekend of reading was before me. Turning to the bookstall, I picked out an Everyman in a dirty jacket. Fantasies, a fairy romance, George MacDonald. Then the 170 train came in. I can still remember the voice of the porter calling out the village names. Saxon and Sweet as a Nut, Bookham, Effingham, Horsley Train. That evening I began to read my new book. The woodland journeyings in that story, the ghostly enemies, the ladies, both good and evil, were close enough to my habitual imagery to lure me on without the perception of a change. It is as if I were carried sleeping across the frontier, or as if I had died in the old country and could never remember how I came alive in the new. For in one sense the new country was exactly like the old. I met there all that had already charmed me in Malory, Spenser, Morris, and Yeats. But in another sense all was changed. I did not yet know, and I was long in the learning, the name of the new quality, the bright shadow that rested on the travels of Anodos. I do now. So, that was what C.S. Lewis said about his first encounter with George MacDonald. And from that first meeting at the age of 16, the older author's works shaped C.S. Lewis on a very fundamental level, a point Lewis makes himself repeatedly, but remarkably a point that did not sink in for me until just recently. Very few people start with Lewis by reading the most advanced of his nonfiction. Still less do they read the dedications and introductions where he talks about his respect for MacDonald. Usually, you start with Narnia and work your way up from there. It dawned on me rather slowly. First, I noted a scene in MacDonald's The Highlander's Last Song that was very similar to the elves leaving Tolkien's Middle-earth. Aha, I thought, a few years ago, I picked up a copy of Fantasies and read the dedication by Lewis. Oh, that surprised me. I then read Lilith by MacDonald and saw the scene where the hero wanders into another world through a piece of furniture in the old house. Remember that scene from the beginning of the Chronicles of Narnia, where Lucy can willingly pass back and forth through the wardrobe. In MacDonald's, it was a mirror, not a wardrobe, and the author had much less agency in going to and from the other world. In fact, it might be a metaphor for him getting sicker and sicker, but the book is never quite clear on that. Finally, I decided that the time and my mental state was right to read, or rather listen to, The Great Divorce. I was ready to process the essay and understand what he was saying. There I met with a shock. Now, this video is getting long, so I don't want to go on much longer, but neither do I really want to leave you on a cliffhanger. I've already told you that I was expecting an essay and found an allegory, but that had nothing to do with my real shock. Anyone who's a reader, and I presume if you're listening to this channel, especially if you listen this far into this video, that you are a reader of sorts. Do you know that feeling, that yearning to talk to an author you admire only to discover that they are long dead? Or even worse, you get the idea to write a question or email an author that used to be alive and you realize that he's only passed away recently? I certainly had it. Most recently, I wanted to interview Patrick McManus, only to remember that I think he's dead. Is he? I'm not sure. Yes, I'm pretty sure he is. But anyway, I have often longed to have the chance to ask C.S. Lewis a question many a time, to have a chance just to talk with that mind that crafted Narnia, Perlandia, and reimagine the story of Psyche and Cupid in a way that could rip my heart out so brutally. And as I became an author myself, and I understand the work and the effort and the genius involved in how he did these things, I begin to feel as someone must feel towards an apprentice, must feel towards their master, the person who helped craft them, towards a teacher. And I began to develop feelings for C.S. Lewis that were much the same that I had for the people who actually taught me how to write. Hey, Fred, if you can hear this, thank you. And there was a certain bittersweet sorrow to these feelings, because you know you'll never be able to talk to them. They're gone. At least not in this life. Well, it turns out that Lewis felt that feeling as well. And just as deeply as I longed to talk with him, he longed to talk with George MacDonald. And he wrote that into The Great Divorce. In the story, C.S. Lewis, or rather his author insert, gets to meet MacDonald and speak to him, to thank him for the gifts contained in his book, and to receive his blessing. Now, in the next few videos, I'll go further down the roots of these stories and how MacDonald's influenced the Inklings, not just C.S. Lewis, but Tolkien and beyond. But for now, I will leave it at the idea that one of the great classics of Western literature is a self-insert fanfiction where the author gets to bask in the love and approval of his hero. Now, if you've already read the Masters and don't mind merely being entertained by a tyro, you can follow the links below the video to check out my book, Humans Are Weird, I Have the Data, A Book of Human Absurdity, Monty Python meets Star Trek. And remember, if you ever advertise a book by comparing it to Monty Python, do not make Monty Python the subject of the first sentence in your post, or Facebook will ding you. So, peace out, my wonderful viewers.
The book from author Betty Adams, Humans Are Weird, I Have the Data, is a humorous look at human behavior through the eyes of aliens. This book is arranged in separate reports or essays, documenting the experiences with humanity through the lens of the aliens who have to interact with them. This anthology of short stories and vignettes from alien points of view highlights some of humanity's quirks we can all relate to. Author Betty Adams captures how strange and interesting humans can really be. This is a fun collection of stories you will really get a kick out of. Humans Are Weird, I Have the Data, from author Betty Adams. Order your copy right now on Amazon.